In a world where there can be lots and lots of challenge in each of our lives and all of our lives, how do people who follow Jesus show up well? We're going to explore this from Matthew chapters 9 and 10. The answer is, in short, compassionately. We'll explore this and how Jesus commissions us to live that everywhere we go. So I want to encourage you to invite somebody to watch along with you. Download the teaching notes. Here we go.
Publish the order is what he said. And I don't know why I had never heard it before. I'd been to a number of these gatherings before, but somehow being at my buddy's retirement out at Nellis Air Force Base in a hangar, much like many of the other ones I had been, I don't know if it was the flair with which Colonel Kennerson said it. I don't know if it was because he was so candid in his remarks that when the shift from his remarks about the career of my friend Brett suddenly turned to the phrase, publish the order, and then a formal reading of a retirement statement that would dismiss someone from a really spectacular career in the Air Force, it just surprised me. I started thinking back through some of the promotion ceremonies that I had been, or the changes of command, where in the same way in each one of those ceremonies, I don't know why I'd never noticed it, it moved from these remarks about what was true and what had happened to suddenly the commissioning of someone to a new responsibility. Whether it was the handing of the colors from one commander to another to be very clear about who now had authority and who now had responsibility, it was remarkably clear. This was the moment that one thing was handed from one person to another, and marching orders had become clear, right? There would be ceremonies across this that happen all the time, and it's a really spectacular thing. If you ever get a chance to support a friend in the military and send one of these out at Nellis or Creech or anywhere else, I would encourage you to do that. In a sense, what we're gonna do for the next 4 weeks together is we're gonna publish the order. Tell somebody, publish the order. This is what we see when we get to Matthew chapter 10, to some of Jesus' closest friends and followers. And for us, it's a reminder of what we wanna launch into the next year with. As we launch into 2026, we just feel like it's important for us to remember who we are, who we're becoming, who God is inviting us to be. Now, some of you who are maybe showing up for the first time or looking for something new, this is a perfect window to look in on who Jesus is and what he is like inviting each one of us into. But before we can get to the commissioning or the sending, we really need to know the posture with which we arrive, which is what we're going to explore today. And so as we get started, here's what I want you to think about. Sort back in your memory just for a moment through 2025. Just pick up any kind of memories, highlights, lowlights along the way. Maybe you've already done this as the new year has turned. Just sort back through the year. I don't know about you, but even in a moment's thought about the last year, my mind immediately starts to wander into the next year. Anybody with me? Like comparing last year to this next year. In fact, just imagine for a moment what you hope for 2026. Call to mind some of the hopes you have, the aspirations, the dreams, the goals, the expectations. Maybe there's a retirement ahead for you, a graduation ahead for you, a promotion ahead for you. Maybe this is a rite of passage from one place to the next. What does 2026 hold for you? Imagine how you hope 2026 will go. Okay, show of hands. How many of you hope it goes worse than last year? I don't think anybody imagined a worse year next year than they had last year. Now, if I'm wrong, you gotta fill me in later, because I'm pretty sure we're batting 1,000 on this. In fact, take a look around the room, even risk the awkward eye contact that might emerge, right? Just take a look around the room. See as many people as you can, as many differences as you can. This is a pretty diverse room in terms of age, background, all kinds of diversity in this room. Not a single person you just made eye contact hopes for worse in 2026 than 2025. In fact, think through the places that you'll go over the course of the next week and all the faces that you'll see and the places that you'll be. From your workplace to your neighborhood, your favorite restaurant, your coffee shop. If you're like me, you'll be there frequently. You won't see a single person who hopes worse for 2026 than 2025. And so here's my question as we launch into this, as we think about the commissioning that Jesus might invite us into in Matthew 10 and the posture he invites us to as we start into it today in Matthew chapter 4. Here's the question we're gonna explore for the next 4 weeks. How do followers of Jesus show up in a world that's always wanting better? We just said 100% of people want better than they've had. There's a sense in us that better is possible, and we actually long for it. Now, I bet if you're like me, if we sat here a year ago, there was probably hardship that emerged in 2025 too that you didn't see coming. Anybody with me, or am I alone? Listen, if I just flipped through I write stuff down, I journal each day with scripture, with some prayer, with some other things, and if I flip through this too carelessly, you'd see several receipts from counseling sessions I went through in 2025 fall out of here. There were challenges in 2025, none of which I had dreamed about or wished for as we sat here a year ago. And the same will be true in 2026. For you and for everybody you encounter, there will be both challenges ahead and dreams for better. How do a people who follow Jesus show up in a world like that? It's easy for us to dream for ourselves, but what I hope and imagine for us as we step into January is, what do we imagine not just for each of us, but for all of us? And not just this us, the us we'll encounter at work and all the other places that we go. Now, as we start to explore this question, every question that we explore around here, we try to begin with Jesus. And so you find your way to Matthew chapter 4, right? Everybody got your Bible? Matthew chapter 4. As much as we want to dream about the future starting with ourselves and what we hope and what we imagine, what we have learned is that when we begin with Jesus, we begin with a much better direction in which we can head. And so that's what we're going to do today. In fact, most of our time today, we're going to look at how Jesus showed up, and then we're going to ask some simple questions about how we show up. Again, if you're finding your way here for the first time, this is not a perfect people. But what we are finding is the more we look at Jesus and the more we look like Jesus, the more we find the life we have hoped for, and people around us find life as well. This is why we start with Jesus. In Matthew chapter, like I said, Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, this is like the beginning of Jesus' ministry, right? If you were around at Christmas, we celebrated his birth. Flash forward about 30 years, and this is where we find him in Matthew chapter 4. Tell somebody Matthew 4. Because here's the thing, I'm gonna encourage you to start there and read the next 4 chapters over the next week or so, all right? We're gonna ask this question from Matthew 4, how did Jesus show up? In verse 23, it says this, as he began his ministry, it says, Jesus traveled throughout the region of Galilee, teaching in the synagogues and announcing, tell somebody announcing, the good news about the kingdom, and he healed, tell somebody healed. He healed every kind of disease and illness. There is this beautiful blend in the ministry of Jesus that I'm gonna encourage you to look at in the next several chapters of both announcing and healing, not either or. It was not just a bunch of information and teaching, it came with action that brought real change. And all of it together painted a picture of a kingdom in which there was a benevolent king where everything would actually go the way people hoped it would go. You see, Jesus arrived in the same kind of world in which we live in. Yeah, first century Palestine was very different than 21st century United States. But in the same way, it was still full of people that if you had looked around any room in that place, you would have made eye contact with a bunch of people who longed for better. Jesus says, I have better in mind, and I'll point you that way. And he did it both by announcing, tell somebody announcing, and healing, tell somebody healing. He said, there's change coming, and I'm gonna show you what that change is like. He was telling and he was showing. He brought teaching and he brought action. And anyone who looks like and follows Jesus should do both the same. And so here's what I wanna encourage you to do, because I don't have time to do it today, is to look at Matthew chapters 5 to 9. Tell somebody 5 to 9. Be a little bit bossy this time, tell them 5 to 9. You gotta look at the life of Jesus. Listen, it's one thing to look at followers of Jesus and imagine what Jesus is like, but that's a little bit like showing up at my dinner table when my kids were toddlers and wondering what I thought about table manners. You know what I'm saying? It's not gonna go well. If you really wanna know, you should look right at the real thing. Look directly at Jesus. So tell somebody one more time, 5 to 9. 5 to 9 in Matthew will give you a beautiful picture of what Matthew, the author of this guy who wrote an account of Jesus' life, introduced in the verse I just read. He said he went about both announcing and healing. That's a pretty good outline for Matthew chapters 5 through 9. In Matthew 5 through 7, Jesus does some announcing, and he answers this question: who and what is important in this kingdom that he is bringing? And if you'll look at Matthew chapters 5 through 7, you'll be surprised. Because in most kingdoms we arrive in, it's the people full of power, the people who have tons of money, those who have influence, the people who are seen and known that are important. Jesus flips that on its head immediately. He says, it's actually the pure in heart. It's actually those who mourn. It's actually those who are poor in spirit that are important in his kingdom. You'll be surprised right from the get. And then when he talks about with what is important, you might be surprised. He goes on in Matthew chapters 8 and 9, and he says, okay, if that's what's important, then what does living in this kingdom that he's bringing actually look like? And Matthew gives us several little stories along the way. So one last time, tell somebody 5 to 9. You want to see what Jesus has in mind, look at Matthew chapters 5 through 9. Because how Jesus showed up could be summed up in one word that we'll get to before long. It's this one, compassion. This is how Jesus showed up. Compassion is a very easy word to define. It's actually a feeling word that begins somewhere in this region right here. Compassion in the Greek language literally meant the guts, like you can feel something so much that you just have to take action. You know what I'm saying? Have you had this where you've seen something, you're like, that's not right, and you just had a desire to do something about it? This is Jesus' gut level response when he looked around and saw things not as they should be. When he saw a world longing for better, his response was compassion. If you break the English word down into its origin, it's compassion. Com means with, and passion means suffer. So what's the definition of compassion? To suffer with, to enter into the mess of other people's lives. Not to pull back from those who are hurting, but to actually lean in and step forward. In a world that is longing for better because we have all felt the lack, we all experience challenge in 2025. And if we're being honest with one another, we know there's challenge ahead in 26. The way Jesus shows up is not with judgment, condemnation, I told you so, or get it together. What he shows up with is a suffering with, a compassion that just says, I need to lean in. This is what I experienced in 2019. In fact, I've experienced lots of times, but especially that year. Have there been times in your life where you were going through challenging times and somebody showed up really, really well? Think back to one of those times and what that meant for you. That when you were, how do we say it? You were a little extra. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't easy to be around you. You just required a little bit extra. And when people could have backed off, instead, because they love you and they care about you, they leaned in. Are y'all tracking with me? What you're getting in that moment is compassion. In 2019, I had the real privilege of open heart surgery. It's super fun. You should try it. At 40 years old, double bypass open heart surgery. And let me just tell you, being around me was not easy. Even before I headed off to surgery, our washer and dryer just broke for no good reason. And I'm just like, literally, I'm gonna go, no, my wife is gonna have so much more responsibility, 4 kids, I'm gonna go be laid up in a hospital and we're not gonna be able to do laundry. I'm like, this is the last thing I need to be figuring out in pre-op. And some friends said, that's not cool. And so suddenly a brand new washer and dryer show up on our front door. They said, hey, we're delivering, tell us what time we can arrive. It wasn't just costly stuff like that. It was the guy who showed up with my favorite candy, hot tamales, but he brought a 5-pound bag because that was the maximum limit I was allowed to lift. Or the one who wrote on my goals for the day on the whiteboard, it says like who your nurse is and all this different thing. He wrote, the goal for the day was 50 push-ups. I'm like, bro. But they showed up. Nobody normally puts on their list navigating a hospital, finding their way through all the catacombs to the right place, and then to sit around with somebody who's not easy to be with. It's costly, right? But because they cared, they suffered with. Are y'all catching what compassion really is? This is how Jesus shows up, and it's what you'll see in Matthew chapters what? What chapters are you gonna read? 5 to 9. He begins, let me go from the backwards, let me go to the end and then come back. In Matthew 8 and 9, you're just gonna see one action after another. Remember, he showed up announcing and healing. This is an outline for those 4 chapters. Matthew talks about a lot of healing in Matthew chapters 8 and 9. He just gathers up a number of stories where Jesus, when he could have pulled back from people who were a little extra, people who were costly, people who longed for better, he leaned in instead. You'll see one after another. Lepers who were like outcasts in society that no one wanted to be around because it was too costly. He drew near and brought healing. A centurion servant. This is the occupying force in a nation who didn't want them to be there. And Jesus says, I'll take care of your servant. That's no problem. I'll lean in. I have compassion. I will suffer with. Those who were afflicted with, whether it was insanity, demon possession, or anything else, where they're paralyzed and unable to move and walk and provide for themselves and had to depend on everyone else. He brought healing. Literally, someone dies and he raises them from the dead. One who could never see and suddenly they can see. Right and left with action, Jesus showed what his kingdom was like. What he was painting a picture of was one day when he would make everything right. He says, I'm inaugurating a kingdom. Let me give you just a taste of what I have in mind for you. And it wasn't even all that only miraculous. It was, you'll see the story of Matthew in there, the one who would write this account that you're going to read this week in 5 through 9. Matthew had betrayed his own people and was collecting taxes for the occupying people, and so he wasn't included anywhere. He was an outcast in every direction. And Jesus says, I would like you to be in my inner circle. Jesus showed up right, left, and center with compassion, which is pretty refreshing, wouldn't you say? I don't know what you thought you'd find when you encountered Jesus. Maybe you thought you would find indifference. It would have been really easy for my friends when I was in the hospital to be indifferent, like, oh, he'll probably be fine. Medical care here is just fine. Food's terrible, but you'll find your way through. No worries, man. We'll see you in a couple months. Could have showed up with indifference. That's not how Jesus shows up. He doesn't show up with indifference. He shows up with concern. He could have showed up with distant condemnation. Like my friends could have said, bro, you're 40 years old, maybe lay off the fries. You know what I'm saying? Nope. They showed up not with distant condemnation, but like Jesus, they showed up by leaning in, suffering with care. They could have showed up, Jesus could have showed up with impatience and frustration. It's easy. We see that right, left, and center. I don't know what your December was like, but the people in my corner of town were a little edgy. Anybody with me? Goodness gracious, the stress, the speed, the frustration, all kinds of stuff. That's so known, but listen, Jesus doesn't show up like that. Maybe we're frustrated with ourselves. Maybe we're impatient with our situation, but that's not how Jesus shows up. He shows up with presence, to draw near, to suffer with, whether we're extra or not. Jesus, like us, encountered people everywhere who were longing for better, and his commitment, you'll see it in Matthew 8 and 9, was to bring better to them. He was painting a picture of what he intends to do completely, not distancing himself from suffering, illness, loss, loneliness, disappointment, discouragement, frustration, or anything else, but instead showing up with compassion, a suffering with. One who would sit next to people and say, it doesn't have to be like this, and giving them the hope, it won't always be like this. So you're going to read Matthew chapters what again? Now, I've only talked about 8 and 9, 5 through 7. If 8 and 9 was Jesus compassionately showing them what the kingdom would be like, Matthew 5 through 7 was him compassionately telling them what the kingdom would be like. And it's not like what you think. He would invite all of the people who had been marginalized, distanced, excused, forgotten, all kinds of places to the center. And it would go deeper into people than they could have possibly imagined. People thought they had religion on lock, and Jesus said, you've heard it one way, but let me tell you, and he gets to the heart of people right to the quick. Listen, in 8 and 9, all of the physical things that were wrecking people's lives, Jesus addressed those with action. But there were also spiritual and internal things wrecking people's lives. As quickly as the inability to walk would ruin people's life in this life, hatred, envy, greed, and anything else would wreck people's lives as well. And Jesus, because he loved us, said, I won't let you stay there. I will show you and tell you a better way. Because sometimes compassion sounds like correction. Jesus wasn't afraid to compassionately tell the truth. Those aren't opposed to one another. There's a way to do both. There's a way to suffer with and bring truth. Like the time that a bunch of people in the front row in student ministry, 300 kids out there, and I'm preaching with my fly open. Somebody help a brother out. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes compassion, y'all checked. I'm fine. I checked on the way up. It's been a habit since that day. Listen, Jesus showed up with compassionate action and compassionate teaching. It is not either or, it's always both. He showed up with compassionate showing and telling. If you're wondering what you're going to find with Jesus, what you're going to find is one who will meet you right where you are in the mess that you are and invite you to somewhere better. He will not force you, but his teaching and his people, his spirit, his word will support us in a direction toward better. He didn't show up and control or demand anything from anyone, but he did ensure that everyone knew they did not have to do it alone. Which always reminds me of my buddy Nate, who entered into all kinds of situations, also in the military, who just the challenging role that these folks had would often cause them to come to a place that they just didn't know a way forward. And he said, listen, I don't know what we're gonna do about that, but here's what I know. You shouldn't go through it alone. This is the way Jesus shows up. It's not a bad picture of compassion. If you're wondering what Jesus had in mind, this is it. This is the gospel. He was sent to suffering. He was marked by compassion. He spoke and acted with compassion. Which shouldn't really be a surprise to us. In fact, Jesus wasn't just a great man. He wasn't just a really good teacher. He's not just a really cool historic figure or like the best philosopher ever. He was actually God-made man. It's what he said about himself, and it's what he proved in his resurrection. And so the whole story of God and who he has always claimed to be should be resonant in Jesus. That's what Hebrews said, that God's fullness is represented in who he is because that's who Jesus is. And so if we reach all the way into the history of the people of God, this is the first time God introduces himself to a man named Moses. He says, my name is Yahweh, the Lord, the God of compassion. The God of what? It's not what he does. It's who he is. It's his character. It's not something we need to earn. He will never change who he is. He is the God of compassion and what else? Mercy. He shows up not with judgment. It's not the starting place, but instead with mercy. I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness, God says. And so we shouldn't be surprised that Jesus shows up with both compassionate teaching and compassionate action. And so finally, now we're in Matthew chapter 9. And we're almost ready to commission one another starting in next week. But let me just continue to tee this up for us. Matthew chapter 9, verse 35. Can you find your way there? This should sound actually really, really familiar if you paid attention to Matthew chapter 4, verse 23. Matthew chapter 9, verse 35 says this: Jesus traveled through all the towns and villages of that area, teaching in the synagogues, and what does it say? Announcing the good news about the kingdom. And then he what? Does this sound familiar? Matthew is like, don't forget what Jesus did, and he healed every kind of disease and illness. But then what he does is he's seeing things, and he's looking across the crowds. It says when he saw the crowds, he had what? He had compassion on them. Right here, things started to move. Like his response to all the challenge across a sea of people was compassion on them because they were confused and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. How easy it would have been to show up with like impatience, frustration, and condemnation, but that's not how Jesus shows up. He shows up with compassion, a willingness not to avoid their suffering or judge their suffering or criticize their suffering or even immediately solve their suffering, but first to suffer with. Compassion is where he starts. He says a couple words are pretty powerful in there. It says they were confused and helpless. The word confused actually reaches its way all the way back to the idea of exhaustion. Anybody experience that? I think we kind of get what exhaustion looks like, where you've tried everything and you come to your wit's end and you're like, oh, I don't even know what to do next. That's the first word. When he looked at everyone, he wasn't frustrated at all they had tried and failed. He had compassion because they were exhausted. The other word he uses that they were confused, and it says helpless, but literally what it means is scattered. They were like running around with chickens with their heads cut off is basically the idea, right? Imagine Lord of the Flies, right? There's just like nobody in charge, nobody knows which way to go. Or here's another image from a movie theater in middle school. Is there anything better in middle school than going to the movies with your friends? You know what's better than going to the movies with your friends in middle school? Is when your parents give you money for candy. That was a great day. I remember one day in particular, they gave me money for Skittles, which was my favorite candy at the time. And so we post up in the back row because we were the cool kids, and we want to see the whole screen and all that kind of stuff. And the theater looked a lot like this. It wasn't like, didn't have the cool recliners that we had now. It had the basic kind of theater seats that we have right now, every other seat basically broken. And the floor was angled like this, but it wasn't stepped like this room is. It was just kind of sloped. You ever been in one of those theaters, right? And so it was a real bummer when I cracked into that bag of Skittles and tried to tear the corner. You see where this is headed? And you know, when you just start tearing, it just doesn't stop, you know? And just this explosion of Skittles. But remember where I'm sitting? in the back row on a sloped floor, right? And so it happened right between previews. And so this preview comes down, rip, you could just hear all of my dreams roll to the front of the room past everybody's dirty feet and week-old popcorn. That's not a bad image of this idea of scattered. As Jesus looked across people, he saw that they were exhausted and scattered. They could never, in the condition that they were, become what they were intended to be. The dream would never be fulfilled, and the longing for better would never come about. And Jesus' reaction to that was not frustration, it was not indifference, it was not judgment, it was not condemnation. It was what? Compassion, a desire to suffer with. He says they were like sheep without a shepherd. They didn't know which way to go. In fact, if you want like extra credit, you should just Google that in the Bible and look at every time across the history of people God that phrase is used. I don't have time to go into it, but they were leaderless. They didn't know which way to go. They needed a better leader. It's like the playground at recess when the teacher's back is turned. It's like Lord of the Flies. It doesn't go well. The blind leading the blind. Jesus looked around and said, this is not good. They're exhausted, they're scattered, and no one is pointing a better way. And Jesus' response was what? He decided to lean in and so that shouldn't really be surprising. What's surprising is what he says next. I would have expected him to just like jump in and take charge, because that's what leaders do, right? Instead, he does this. He said to his disciples or his followers, those who were taking on his way of life, the harvest is great, but the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest and ask him to send more workers into his fields. Jesus' response, his compassionate response, was to commission those who were taking on his way of life to become announcers and healers, to become teachers who take action, to send others, to take the authority that had been granted him and hand it to others so that they might embody the same kind of life that he had. As he looked across the work that we've done in the harvest field that was big, he's like, we need more people. Now, I know harvest isn't really a big thing here in Vegas, but where I grew up in the Midwest is a big deal. In fact, there was always at least one day in the fall, somewhere in September, maybe early October, where half the class would be empty. You know why? Because every kid who could lift even 50 pounds or 40 pounds would be sent off to the farm because it was time for harvest. You didn't get to decide when that would happen. When things were ready, it was time, and it was go time, and all hands were on deck. What Jesus is saying, as he looked around at a world longing for better, a world just like ours, is he was saying, it's go time, and we need all hands ready to go. Maybe out here in the West, maybe it's when the grapes are ripened in a vineyard, or maybe up here at the orchard where we got to make sure those apples come in on time, otherwise we're not going to get those donuts we all love. You know what I'm saying? Jesus is like, this is not good. More workers are needed. And so he doesn't just go to work himself, he commissions workers. This was Jesus' compassionate response to model and teach what life in his kingdom would be like, and then to hand the authority to his followers to take that message everywhere. He had met people in their suffering. In fact, when you read Matthew chapters 5 through 9, you'll see that Levi is caught up in this. Peter's mother-in-law is healed. And I got mixed reviews on that. You know what I'm saying? But he had met them in their suffering. And he was going to ask them, who is willing to meet others in theirs? Followers of Jesus, has Jesus met you in your suffering? Has he taught you a better way, compassionately pointed you to better? Has he compassionately showed up for you in challenges you didn't expect? Jesus had done this with the people he was speaking to, and now he was asking the question, now who's gonna go meet other people in their suffering? Jesus says, I've modeled compassion in a suffering with, who will go suffer with others? He had shown compassion to them. The question was, who would show compassion to others? Spoiler alert, it's everyone who's taking on Jesus' way of life. But first, we have to ask the question, will we show up like Jesus showed up? When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. When Jesus entered a world full of people longing for better, he didn't show up with frustration. He didn't show up with impatience. He didn't show up with sarcasm, critique, criticism, pointing a finger in blame, or looking for someone else to solve the problem. He began with compassion. And so as we kind of launch into this commissioning and remembering who we are for the next 3 or 4 weeks, I just want to ask us some simple questions. Maybe we should just get really honest with ourselves for a moment. What happens in us when we see the crowds like Jesus saw? Are we marked by compassion in the same way? In fact, here's why I think some people who would show up here and hear that Jesus is marked by compassion might be surprised, because they've met people who call themselves Jesus followers, and that's not what they found. I just wonder if it's worth us asking ourselves again, are we growing in compassion? Let's just give ourselves a little bit of test for just a minute. Y'all ready? Suppose we're driving along an interstate, and up ahead we see like way too many blue and red lights flashing on the right side, and suddenly traffic is starting to narrow to one side. What stirs up in us when we realize a drive did not go the way someone had intended? What rises up in us? I hope what rises up in us is like I wish there was something I could do. I hope that they're okay, and we lean in. Anybody with me? Okay, cool. Suppose we're on the same road and somebody blows by us at 95 miles an hour, swerves right in front of us, and then heads on down the road. And a mile down the road, we see one set of blue and red lights, and it's that car pulled over. Now what's happening in you? It's not compassion for me. I'm just saying I got room to grow. What stirs up in us when we sit down on the airplane and a mom in a flurry of Cheerios and pacifiers brings 4 toddlers into our row? What stirs up in us? When we show up at the place and the line is way longer and moving way slower than we intended, what stirs up in us? When someone shows up and is just a little bit extra, a little bit lazy, a little bit slower than we wish, more rude to us than we have earned, what stirs up in us? You see, when Jesus looked across the crowd, he saw all those things and more. The offense wasn't just to one another. It wasn't just struggle at a distance, and he didn't back away. What did he do? He leaned in and he suffered with. He showed up with compassion. I just got to confess, I show up with indifference way more than I wish I did. I drive on by and I'm just glad I can keep going. I got some like compassion fatigue, because sometimes I'm scrolling up and see so many problems in the world, I just throw my hands up in the air like I wouldn't know what to do about any of it if I could, so I'll just decide not to care about it because I'm tired. I'll tell you this, I show up a lot with complaint. Maybe not out loud. I've grown past that a fair bit, most of the time, some of the time. Okay, a lot of the time. I criticize. Met any critics? I show up with criticism a fair bit. I can be condescending at times. I can show up with sarcasm. And I'm real good at blame. You ever met anybody who's really good at blame? I can point a finger with the best of them, right? I can point it at systems, I can point it at governments, I can point it at people. I can give all kinds of suggestions about how things are right. But listen, none of those ways are the ways Jesus showed up. How did he show up? With what? And so I just wonder if we could just, we don't need to be afraid because Jesus already paid for all of it. We can just acknowledge where we are and ask Jesus to take us somewhere better. But it begins by being honest with ourselves. Do we show up the way Jesus showed up? Because if he's gonna commission us the way that he is, if he's gonna send us to be like him, we need him to make us like him. And so I just wonder if a week of like cultivating compassion could be our next step. In fact, here's one of a few suggestions for us to like show up more like Jesus than ever. If we really wanna cultivate compassion, one of the best things we can do is reflect on what we've actually received. In Matthew chapter 10, we'll get to it in the next couple of weeks, he says, give as freely as you have received. Followers of Jesus, have you experienced Jesus' compassion? Can I get a head nod from anybody who knows? Man, he says, give as freely as you have received. And so maybe we should just pause for a minute and remember how freely we have received. That how extra we have been with him. How costly, how frustrating, how slow, how entitled we have been at times. And remember how gracious and compassionate he continues to show up with us. If we reflect on what we've received, it might stir up in us like, oh, that's what I'm to hand on to others. Why am I worthy of this, but they're not worthy of mine? And then we just ask God to bring change in us. Listen, if you're like trying to find your way in the direction of Jesus, this is not something you like stir up and make happen to yourself. The hope of Jesus is that when we trust him, he's the one that changes us. So we shouldn't just reflect on what we've received. We should ask God, make me more compassionate. Help me show up with compassion. Make me more like you. This is the Spirit's role in our lives. That's why we look always at him and remember who he is. He stirs this up in us and shapes us in us. And then, listen, you got to put yourself to the test a little bit. I told you it's January and lots of people out there going to the gym, right? And if that's you, keep going. That's all I'm saying. Just keep going. But if you show up at the gym and listen to the trainer and never do what they say, you are not going to change shape at all. You're going to have a whole bunch of information and all the same bad habits. If we really want to cultivate compassion, here's what you got to do. You got to get close to suffering. Instead of pulling back from it, you got to step toward it, because you don't suffer with at a distance. There's no compassion at some length away from people. Arm's length, safe distance. If you can't hear it, sense it, feel it, smell it, all those kinds of things, we're not close enough to experience compassion. Jesus didn't point at a leper a half mile away and say, be healed. He got close and embraced him immediately. There's a way in which we need to get closer. It's easy to look at a distance through a phone and be overwhelmed by all the struggle that we see around us. It's one completely different thing to get very local with people we actually live with and could show up compassionately with. Maybe that kind of test would cultivate compassion in us. Maybe walk your neighborhood. Maybe drive a little slower. Crazy idea, I know. Maybe sit just a little bit longer. Listen just a little more closely. Maybe you've heard this. Robin Williams re-quoted someone, but he said it pretty sharply. He said, everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Have you heard this? Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And so he says, be kind, always. I'm just thinking, maybe we should go slow enough and stay long enough and get close enough with enough compassion that we might even find out what that struggle is. Not because we are the solution or we'll always know what to do. 99% of the time, I don't know what to do with people suffering. I'm not the solution. But I know Jesus will join them in it. And I can stand in his presence and say what my friend said, I don't know what to do about that, but I'm pretty sure you shouldn't do it alone. To show up with compassion. Jesus said that the harvest is great and the workers are few. And listen, what he's gonna say, spoiler alert, is he's gonna send workers. Ask the Lord of the harvest to send workers is what he says. This is a bold and a little bit risky prayer, because if you actually go get close to suffering and pay close attention and then you pray this prayer, you might be the one sent. Spoiler alert, if you're a follower of Jesus, you are the one sent. So it says, so pray to the Lord of the harvest and ask him to send workers into the fields. So maybe that's the last thing we should do, is examine ourselves first, cultivate compassion intentionally as we step into this year, and then go into the fields and pray. Where will you go get close to suffering? Wherever that is, go and pray. If it's your neighborhood, great. If it's your workplace, great. If it's your coffee shop, great. If it's a new place, great. If it's a gym, great. But if they got headphones in, leave them alone. They're doing their thing. Jesus traveled all the towns and villages, is what it said in Matthew chapter 9 and in Matthew chapter 4. You're going somewhere. Where are you going? Wherever you're going, cultivate a heart of compassion. Ask God for a heart of compassion. Stay long enough to get close to suffering, and then ask God in that moment to send workers into the harvest. It's what he'll do, but I just think this is the best place to start. Cultivate compassion and ask God to send us. Here's what I don't want you to miss, is that Jesus' compassionate response to a world overwhelmed by suffering was two things. One, he inaugurated a kingdom that would eradicate suffering in the end, and he painted one picture after another of how good it would be, and he invited everybody into it. Only Jesus can do that. But then what he did is he commissioned all of his followers to take the same compassion and show and tell others exactly what that kingdom looked like.
As God helps us take on Jesus' heart of compassion and showing up well with others, He simultaneously commissions us and sends us out. And so may we be the people who go everywhere in Jesus' name with compassion. If we can support you in any way, we'd love to. Head over to canyonridge.org where you'll find everything you need to know, along with a way to get in touch with us. And if this was helpful to you, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button, share it with a friend. We'll see you soon.